Hi, and welcome back to Jewish Philosophy Matters with me, Simeon Lerner, and Reb Chaim Eisen and Reb Yitzchok Adlerstein. We're following on from last week's discussion, where we were talking about the efficacy of prayer. The discussion went from one side talking about the reality behind prayer, the halachic framework, and what we are committed to happening, that in effect does take place when we pray. But we got stuck a little bit on talking about mechanism and about, if I'm going to genuinely call out to the Almighty, I have to think on some level I'm doing something that will affect the outcome. Otherwise, you can't genuinely call out. You only call out to that which you think will have an effect. So moving the discussion to incorporate that, as well as to open the door up to other topics, specifically the idea of Talmud Torah and Gemilas Chasodim. Now, the reason why these sort of go into the same bucket is because when we talk about doing something, especially where we find ourselves right now in relationship to the tragedy and the war effort that's happening at the moment, we are all encouraged to pray. We are also all encouraged to, especially in the yeshiva world, to engage in Talmud Torah and throughout the world, acts of good deeds, Gemilas Chasodim. And I think to perhaps drill in the power of this question, perhaps a story is in order. When we say that Gemilas Chasodim work or Talmud Torah work, people actually believe this. I believe there's a story that's brought up in, I think it's Masechtas Tainus, where you have one of the Rabbonim, or one of the Chachamim, who has a problem with his home. And there's a structural integrity issue. And I think he has beer. And he doesn't want the house to fall down on his beer. So he goes with his study partner, and they both study Torah to prevent the house from falling. Now, this, I think, is criticized in the story, but it seems to work. The question, and if I've got the story wrong, of course, feel free to correct me, but the question is, if you actually believe this works, not lip service that it works, it actually works. Talmud Torah protects, prayer works in a causal relationship with our Creator. You are kind of morally obligated to start learning Torah in front of a tank, as someone put it. Learn Torah on a fighter jet. And if you believe your prayer really works the way perhaps some people say they do, why are we not all constantly obligated to be praying for not only the situation now, but any moral ill in the world, from starving children in Africa to tsunamis? I mean, if this works, as some people perhaps like to say it works, that adds a whole bucket of responsibilities. So to pose the question to first Rabbi Chaim Eisen, we're talking about prayer, we're talking about Gemilas Chasodim, we're talking about Talmud Torah. We on some theological level are committed to the idea of this working. What do we mean by that?
So I'd like to address this on a couple of different planes. That is, first, when we ask the essential question, on what basis would I expect what I am doing to have an effect on others? I think what's most critical for us to establish here is we do indeed posit that there exists a whole, Klal Yisrael, the world that transcends the sum of its parts. Of course, this is an idea that is famously enunciated in the Gemara in Masechtas Shavuos, with respect to Kol Yisrael Arivim Zeh Bazeh. Now, the context in which the Gemara and the Medrash enunciate this principle is, if anything, on the negative side. That is, v'chashlu ish be'achiv, ish be'avon achiv. That when one person commits a sin, then it can have an effect on others, because there is this arvos, there is this commonality of responsibility that pertains to the nation qua nation. But of course, conceptually, it certainly operates in the opposite direction as well. And indeed, furthermore, the principle that is extracted from the Gemara that Rambam famously codifies in Hilchos Tshuva, laws of Tshuva, repentance, in chapter 3, that one should appreciate the significance and impact of even a single deed that one does, because when one does that one single solitary deed, the consequence of that can be that he has shifted the balance. If it's a good deed, talking about the positive sense, that he's shifted the balance of himself to zechut, to merit, And it's not just something that applies to him as an individual. That it can even be a matter of the world is teetering on the brink, and a single solitary good deed that he does is what tips the balance for the sake of the entire world. In other words, again, to appreciate the significance of the deed that one does, not only with respect to oneself. Of course, in this regard, I feel compelled to add an additional dimension that while this unequivocally applies to the entire nation and to the entire world, there is a particular layer of intensity that applies to the nation when in the land of Israel. That is, this is an idea that is, I guess you could say, on two different planes, enunciated in the Gemara. The Gemara at the end of Masechet Brachot and Daf Nun Chet, that ein uchlusa b'Bavel, that in Chutz La'aretz there isn't this concept of a klal and uchlusa, and the Gemara in Harayot, the beginning of the Masechet, that Hane, referring to Yoshvei Eretz Israel, hu de'ikre kahal. That is the concept of kahal, the larger group, is something that applies specifically to Yoshvei Eretz Israel and not the Yoshvei Chutz La'aretz, which of course is also something that Rambam rules in Hilchos Shigagos. So to that extent, in particular Eretz Israel, when one does something, one is impacting upon a greater whole that transcends oneself as an individual. And that's the first point that we wanted to enunciate. The second is, with respect to this question of, so can we really discern this transformative impact of the single deed that one does? If I can appropriate here a crude analogy to something that anyone who ever took an introductory course in physics can well appreciate, at least in introductory courses. You solve problems assuming frictionless surfaces, airless voids, in order to avoid problems of friction, avoid problems of air resistance, and so on and so forth. And the student can well argue, this is an exercise in futility. It's completely irrelevant because the real world isn't at all like this. And our response would be, on the one hand, you're right. In the real world, there are no frictionless surfaces, and even the best so-called terrestrial vacuum is not really a vacuum. But the processes that are invoked in solving the problem are real. They simply may be masked by other considerations, by countervailant principles that may result in, you're not seeing the clear-cut effects of what you think you're solving in the physics problem. The same thing is true here. That is, we unequivocally posit that tefillah is efficacious, that Talmud Torah is efficacious, that the asim Tovim that we do are efficacious, in the sense that they have impact. How? We don't necessarily know. We do something down here and we start the gears turning, and the gears turn up there. It certainly is an idea that we see enunciated by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in Sefer HaKuzarei, in particular in the third treatise of Sefer HaKuzarei in section 53. Maybe we can talk about it afterwards. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to discern transparent, facile connections, because the world is a complicated place, and in a complicated place, things can be obscured. So on those two planes, I hope we can get something of a handle on the one hand, affirming unequivocally the significance of that which we do, of everything that we do, for better and sometimes not for better. But either way, what we do has impact and can even be machriya, it can be decisive for the entire world. Because the greatest gift that God gives us is responsibility. At the same time, are we going to be able to see a facile connection? Probably not.
Okay, thank you. So that's to draw it into our own, to maybe say or summarize. So we've got the idea, the way you phrased it in the reference to the Rambam, and us having this responsibility and our actions being treated as if they're on the knife edge, thereby giving on the one side the efficacious nature of our actions and our tefillah. And in terms of drawing that causal link, there's always, I suppose you would call it in Talmudese, there's always the potential of countersiebas. There's always the possibility there are counter causes that we are unaware of in the nature of reality that we are making effect. What that effect, how that effect plays itself out, is going to be beyond our call. And then, all right, okay. In which case, Rabbi Yitzchak, how would you like to step into the fray with that in mind?
Very gingerly. I'm not sure that my esteemed colleague answered the question as to how it worked. I loved listening to him intone so magnificently about our certainty that prayer is efficacious, that our mitzvahs are efficacious, and nothing really to add to that. I think once again, he's proving the real assumption behind this whole series, that it all starts with Rishonim and the firm grasp of what they said. But moving somewhat beyond that into the rarefied atmosphere of, so like exactly how and why? Well, if you gave me about 20 hours, I could really get to the fundamental issue and prove that I know nothing about it, which is like, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu bother altogether? What does he want from man? What is this all about? And that ultimately is the real question. This gap between our understanding of what he is and the fact that a God who has no needs tells us that in some sense, Kaviyachol, he does need, and he wants our actions. And at the same time, he has told us that he wants us to daven to him. He wants us to do mitzvos. What the Maral effectively calls the mysterium tremendum. Hope I'm not going to get my windows broken for using that phrase of Yiddishkeit. Since Baruch Hashem, we don't have a Trinity to work with, but we do have this issue of how could it be that if we're all aiming for spirituality, that the Torah tells us that it is dafka through acting in the material world, in doing things in this phantom of a world which really has no significance because it's all Elokus and it's all HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and this is all smoke and mirrors. But guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Smoke and mirrors is all we've got, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to work with it, and he has pledged to us that dafka, through responding to his ratzon, he responds. That when we look at the world that we're in, we're conscious of the fact that we are capable operators. That means that we can manipulate the things in our environment and get things done. According to the Zohar, everything in this world is a mirror of the spiritual world, is a refraction of those worlds. And the HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to know that we are also effective in the spiritual realm. You know, everybody knows the Rashi that in the beginning of Devarim, that Adam HaRishon spanned from one end of the earth to the other and Mi'aretz al Shamayim. And that was before the Chet. And after the Chet, what do you think happens? So if we were filling in the blank, we'd say he got reduced to a size 42 regular. Now he's just one of us down here. But that's not what the Medrash says. Rashi doesn't quote the end of the Medrash. The end of the Medrash is that he was reduced to a size of 100 amos by 100 amos, which basically makes him like an oversized SpongeBob. But what does that mean? Says the Maral, it means that don't think that man's presence that used to fill up the entire cosmos has been reduced to just his arba amos, to just his immediate environment. No, the dignity of man is such that even in the post-Chet world, we have the ability to manipulate, it's too strong a word perhaps, but to work upon the spiritual through the material. Now, that is what we do when we do mitzvahs. Why HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do them? That's a longer discussion, which now's not the time for it. But that is the clear record of the Torah. Talmud Torah, I think, has a different mechanism. The Ramchal writes very clearly that of all the different kinds of hashpa'os, influences, and he uses a word which Reb Chaim is more at home with than I am, because it is a word from the Rishonim, the idea of shefa, but of all the different hashpa'ot that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends to earth, he created one which is super powerful and is contained within the words of Torah. So in effect, when you learn Torah, you are binding the Shekhinah, the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, closer to the world. If you want a simplistic mechanism, that's how Talmud Torah works. You bring the Shekhinah close to the world. Evil is the absence of the Shekhinah. It's the absence of Hashem's presence. And when you fill up the void, or you supplant the evil there by the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're going to see good things. Now, whether you have to do that in close proximity to a tank, or you can do it from 9,000 miles away, I can't weigh in on. I have a feeling that geography is not as important as some people think, but I'm not going to rule out the possibility. But that's the way I conceive of tefillah work, of Talmud Torah in particular, working.
Okay.
If I may just quibble with respect to one aspect here, and it's going to be
only one. Whoa! This is my night.
Well, it's going to be a characteristic quibble, and that is as Rabbi Yitzchak knows me very well, I'm Baruch Hashem encumbered with a bias that is born of spending so much time with the Rishonim that when you relate to this world as just smoke and mirrors, I have to beg to differ. I don't see that in the Rishonim. That is, on the contrary, I have far, far greater difficulty with a formulation that smacks of Elokus Chalila v'chas in this world. Because we have to remember, pantheism is a heresy. It's a heresy even if it comes wearing a Stramla Bekasha. And it often does. So we recognize that this world is adarabah, something that is vested with significance because HaKadosh Baruch Hu created it with that significance. And on some plane, and here we invoke, if you will, the Kabbalistic concept, which is undoubtedly an irreducible enigma of Tzimtzum, that this world really exists. I have to admit that the idea that would negate that existence is something that I don't find in any early sources at all. So on the contrary, that is the greatest gift that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us is responsibility by placing us in a world in which we are significant players. And if anything, on the contrary, that is the stature of Adam HaRishon before and after the Chet, I'll read as an affirmation of that indeed HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we read explicitly, of course, in Mizmor Chet, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has crowned us with honor and glory and withheld from us but little of the divine. It's a humongous haskama that we read in Tehillim, and it indeed vests our actions with profound significance.
Okay, can I jump in here now?
Sure.
So it's an interesting one because on the one side, Rab Yitzchak did introduce a new mechanism, which I'm happy about, because previously we just draw ourselves back to last week's discussion. We spoke about the efficacy of prayer in the reference to the changing of the self. You touched in on this sort of explanation, but the focus was very much on the changing of the self, either as you described through the Maharal's approach or the Shamshon of Bala Hirsch's approach. But this introducing of another mechanism, which was the affecting the spiritual worlds, and then the more extreme expression of that is the, I think I heard it put once as this brush stroke over individual painting of correcting the world that Talmud Torah does, according to the Ramchal. Reb Eisen's issue with that painting, no pun intended, wasn't so much, from what I heard, wasn't the mechanisms you described. It was actually drawing earlier to the pantheistic or panentheistic trends of the illusion or Maya, or this world not being real, but just being an expression of the divine will. And the closer Hashem is to this illusion, the less evil or bad there is in the world. My question, perhaps to put to Rab Eisen, would you take issue with his efficacy regarding Talmud Torah being extra special powerful, to use a perhaps a simplistic phrase? Do you have something to say on that point particularly? Because I think there was a new mechanism that was introduced, and I want to see how you would play around with that. Why would the Rambam, now you could perhaps say that the Rambam does look at evil as being an absence, not a actual thing, which interestingly enough, I think the Mukabalim, generally speaking, say evil's an actual concept, an actual positive, because thereby you can actually conquer it. But the Rambam does look at the idea that the more
absence,
evil is an absence. So that was a bit of a hodgepodge, but how would you approach the idea of Talmud Torah being specifically more important, the Keneged Kulam type of thing that we should be really devoting our time to?
First of all, of course, you just tacitly answered the question by quoting Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. And I'll add the additional dimension in Masechet Sotah of Talmud Torah, as opposed to merely, not to in any way minimize the importance of it, merely doing mitzvot, is magna u'matzla. That is, it provides a level of protection, a level of salvation that we don't associate with anything else other than Talmud Torah. If you ask me how that works on the most rudimentary plane, if I may answer waxing Maimonidean, I'll state, because the essence of man is the endowment of the mind. That is, Rambam emphasizes this from some obscure place in Moreh Nevuchim, like the first chapter. You can't really get to more prime real estate than that. That the commonality, so to speak, of endowing man with Tselem Elokim, Dmut Elokim, the essence, the likeness of the divine, is the endowment of Seichel. So when you do mitzvahs, you're doing mitzvahs with the various accoutrements that you have in your physical body. But when you rivet your mind to Kivyachol, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will as enunciated in the Torah, then you are transforming the very essence of what you are. So of course it's going to have a more earth-shaking consequence than anything else. But the essential modality is the same. The modality is the realization that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has vested us with responsibility and the wherewithal to indeed do something that is of significance. This is the opportunity, and of course, whenever HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives an opportunity, it instantly morphs into responsibility to seize upon the opportunity. So he gave us this mind. He gave us the wherewithal. He gave us the bechira to be able to choose what we're going to be doing with our lives, and to that extent to actualize what otherwise might remain merely a latent potential. That is, this is, of course, most critically the essence of man. And in this context, I feel beholden first and foremost to Rav Yitzchak's premier source, Maharal. That is, this is the essence of what man is. Man is called Adam because, especially to the mentality of the agrarian society, what represents more than anything else the means for actualizing a latent potential is the earth. Let's take a little seed, put it in the earth, and a mighty tree grows there. And so too, man comes into this world as nothing but latent potential. A newborn baby, pure physicality, nothing spiritual. And the course of life is the opportunity to actualize that potential. Talmud Torah, of course, plays the most critical aspect of the actualization of that potential. But every time we do a spiritual act, and that pertains to every mitzvah, then we are engaging in a transformative act. That's precisely, of course, what Rambam tells you in his commentary on the final Mishnah of Maseches Makos, that the zechus, the merit of giving us this superabundance of Torah and mitzvahs is the opportunity to really latch on to even one and do it, so to speak, with all the trimmings, and as a result, to be actualized spiritually. And that becomes the basis, not only of what we become in this world, but what we become in everlasting life.
So, in which case, how would Reb Yitzchak describe the difference between your efficacy, which is you do the thing because you're commanded to do the thing, and thereby you know there is an effect, and you're committed there is an effect, exactly the other causes that you don't know about, but you're committed to there is an effect, over the way, Reb Yitzchak, how you described it as being spiritual parallelism, What's the actual difference? Or are you just basically using different language to describe the same phenomena?
I hope when the dust settles, I have no idea when that will be, that we'll be able to demonstrate that the gap between the approach of even the strict Maimonidean rationalist, of which Rabbi Eisen I know is not one, and the world of the really out there Mukubalim is not, the gap between them is not as significant as people think. That first of all, the roots go back to the same time. They go back to the same Torah. Rabbi Eisen gave his last words were brilliant and beautiful, but the Ramban would, I imagine, be comfortable with some of my vocabulary and some of the approach. In a word, what's the difference between the approaches? One of them is centered on man, and the other one is centered on man's capacity to affect the cosmos, man's link in with the greater universes out there. Now, ultimately, there may be no tension between them at all. These are both parts of what man's task is in this world. Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, who's another one of the greatest influences on my life, was less wary of Kabbalah than people think. He did study it. There are places where he incorporates it, but he writes openly in one place that his real beef with the world of Kabbalah, with the approach of Hasidus, really, by his time, was that you take everything in the Torah and you turn them into what he called magic mechanisms. And that way you lose the entire outlook of looking to the Torah for ethical development, for what the Torah is telling me to do as an individual, how I'm supposed to grow. And of course, the proper mahalach, of course, is to drink deeply from both of these reservoirs, and hope that one day you'll find that there's a passageway that connects them. But yes, on the surface, that is the difference. The world of some Mukubalan can be to use whatever knowledge HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us to manipulate, to use tzirufei shemos, or the right, and whatever, to make changes according to the ability that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us to influence those worlds directly. While those on the more rationalist side would say that may all be true, but that's not really interesting to me. First of all, because I can't define the terms, and I can't really grasp them. And I know that part of my job is to worry about me as an individual, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will sort out the rest. So, both of those are legitimate pathways. I would just add that Reb Chaim, in your pushback against the world of smoke and mirrors, I didn't mean to align myself perfectly with it. You're aware that the one who championed that, to my knowledge, the most was the Alter Rebbe. And there was plenty of pushback from other Hasidim, from other Rebbes, who believed very strongly in the reality of reality. So I chose it because there's something very, very potent and true in it, that ultimately, from the way we sit, in a way, the reality. Well, let me backtrack on that. Rav Yerucham Levovitz used to say that when people learn Unklis, and they see that whenever there's a reference to something that sounds anthropomorphic, Unklis covers up for it in 9 cases out of 10. So when there's a discussion in the Torah of Yad Hashem, he doesn't translate it as Yada. He translates it as something that, something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does. So he says, everybody understands why Unklis does that, because we have hands. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't have a hand. Yerucham said, really, just the opposite is true. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a real hand. Our hand is not real. It's just an imitation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hand. His is the real hand. There's a lot of profound truth in that. Now it doesn't, and it should not take away from the beauty of Rabbi Eisner's message, that if your head is up in the clouds like that all the time, it takes away from the preciousness of the reality that we are in, which is the only reality we know, and the job that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given to us. So you have to be like Yaakov's ladder. You have to have, you got to be a sulam mutzav arza. Your feet got to be in the ground, and Rosh Magia Hashamayma. And according to many, what Yaakov appreciated in that chalom was that the way to ascend that ladder has to be by being planted here in the ground, and there's a constant process of aliyah and yerida, which incorporates the reality of the here and now.
So I think that's a great place to stop, even though I'm sure you both have way more to say on the topic, but I think it would be a fairly interesting segue to draw out perhaps two opening questions for our next discussion. How would Rabbi Yitzchok step away or protect against Rav Hirsch's critique of, if you are aware of these mechanisms, then use them, and thereby you retain perhaps in your mind something that's working, but then you treat God in a mechanistic way, in which case we slip into the way Rav Hirsch describes what happened with Bilam and his relationship to the divine, which is a mechanistic relationship. So that's perhaps one direction. And the other direction is this idea of the dangers of even flirting with anthropomorphism, however valuable it may be, or according to some, however true it may be. I think those will be two interesting topics for us to open up with next week. Thank you to both of our speakers, and as always, have a wonderful week.